Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Arscott, Stroud Water Research Center. We'll begin shortly. Just wait a few more minutes for the majority of our audience to join. Thank you for joining us.
We all live in a watershed. At Pennsylvania American Water, we are deeply protective of our watersheds because millions of people depend on us every day for safe, clean drinking water. We take care of water from the source to the tap and back to the source again, taking pride in returning it cleaner than we found it. Join us in keeping our watersheds clean, so together we can keep life flowing for generations to come.
Okay, I need to unmute. Haven't heard that enough this year already. Thank you all for joining. My name's Dave Arscott. I'm Executive Director and Research Scientist at Stroud Water Research Center. Welcome to our webinar celebrating American River's designation of River of the Year for the Delaware River. Before we get into our planned discussion today, I'd like to do a little housekeeping. Let you all know that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you all afterwards. I'd invite you to use the chat box right now if you'd like to share with us where you're joining from. We'd love to hear where our audience is coming from. And also let you know that we will be taking questions from the audience and would like you to use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar platform. So please submit your questions there. We will reserve the last 5 or 8 minutes of the time we have today to address your questions. So once again, thank you for joining. And today our topic in this 4-part webinar series celebrating the River of the Year designation is how collaboration between states ensures adequate drinking water supply across the Delaware River Basin. And thank you to our sponsors for supporting this event. Just let you know again, this is a 4-part webinar series, and we do have the 4th and final webinar upcoming, and I'll provide those details at the end of today's event. Now, I guess I'll jump into introductions with our panelists and ask each of our esteemed panel here to give a short introduction name, organization, and maybe the entities that you all work with. Gary.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm Gary Bellam. I'm the Senior Director of the Clean Water Supply Program at American Rivers. We work with a lot of local groups on the ground in the Delaware Basin, particularly in a lot of urban areas. Really like to thank the Stroud Water Research Center for hosting these conversations. The mission of American Rivers is to protect wild rivers, restore damaged rivers, and conserve clean water for people and rivers. And to accomplish this, we do a lot of work trying to reduce the pollution coming off of our urban areas into our local rivers and streams. So American Rivers has some great local staff in the Delaware Basin working with our community-based partners and our municipal partners to do this. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Andy?
Thanks, Dave. Well, first, thanks very much to Stroud and also to American Rivers. It's such a great honor for anyone who's worked on the Delaware, regulators, environmentalists, utilities, et cetera, for our river to be named as the River of the Year. So thank you for that, for recognizing the work of so many people toward that. I used to work for many years, over 30 years, with a wastewater utility that discharges into the Delaware River, the Camden County Municipal Utilities Authority. I retired from there last year, and since then I've been working as a senior advisor for the Water Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and also part-time as a senior fellow to the U.S. Water Alliance, which works on water equity issues. The University of Pennsylvania, of course, and Water Center is working on water issues and water equity issues in the Delaware Valley, and it's led by Howard Mukrug, the former water commissioner at Philadelphia. And then lastly, I also serve as the managing director for Moonshot Missions, which is a nonprofit which is designed to work with water equity issues for underserved communities. So basically my work is trying to merge technical solutions for water with equity issues, especially for underserved communities. And it's a great pleasure to be on this panel, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks, Andy. Jeff?
Yes, hi. Thanks, Dave. Thanks to Stroud and American Rivers for inviting me on today. I'm Jeff Skelding. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Friends of the Upper Delaware River. We're based up here in Hancock, New York, right where towards the top of the river. Most of my comments today will be relevant to the New York portion of the watershed, and also Northeast Pennsylvania, where we spend most of our time and energy. So my organization started out as actually an angling organization paying attention to the world-class wild trout fishery of the Upper Delaware River, and has since expanded over the last 17 years to what I would describe as more of a community-based watershed organization that factors in not just fish, but also watershed considerations, economy, people, communities. I was formerly the national campaign director for the Great Lakes Restoration Campaign and the Healing Our Waters Coalition, working for National Wildlife Federation in Washington, but left there 8 years ago and came up here to the more rural areas of the Delaware River watershed, which I hope to shed a little bit of light on today in my comments. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. And last but certainly not least, Steve.
Thank you, Dave, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Tambini. I'm the executive director of the Delaware River Basin Commission. The commission is celebrating 60 years of managing, protecting, and improving the Delaware River Basin this specific year. I do want to say that I agree with American Rivers that the Delaware River is a national treasure, and certainly appreciate the recognition as 2020 River of the Year. I also agree with American Rivers that there's more work to be done. So I'm sure we're going to talk about that as well. So thank you for inviting me to the conversation today.
Yeah, thanks. Just a reminder that we are recording the webinar today and we'll make it available to you all. So I'd like to set up our first questions here for our panel. Recognize that the title of our theme today is talking about water supply and maybe through a drinking water supply lens, but also recognize, I think all of our panelists recognize that the connection between water quality and water quantity is a tight one. So you'll maybe hear some thoughts through both those lenses from our panel today. And just to maybe introduce the supply issue and water availability, just some terminology that may be used today. When we talk about water supply from our surface waters and how it's used, oftentimes you'll hear consumptive use versus non-consumptive use. The difference, these uses are both potential uses by society, for example, industries and municipalities to service various sectors of our societal infrastructure. Consumptive is sort of categorizing the water that's used and actually withdrawn from a watershed and perhaps transported to another watershed or another locale and does not return to the hydrologic system. Whereas non-consumptive use is typically for those uses of water that eventually return to the water accounting framework within the basin from which it might have been extracted or sourced. There are some other uses that come in here. There's recreational use, and it's most clearly connected to how Jeff has introduced the Friends of the Upper Delaware with angling and other uses in a non-consumptive or consumptive way. And then there's environmental use or environmental flow, and that is considering the water that ecosystems need to continue to provide the beneficial services that we all enjoy. So with that said, I'd really like to start at a point where we consider major policies that have led to water security in the Delaware River Basin for the stakeholders that each of our panelists represent. And maybe we'll try to funnel from sort of the broader nationwide perspective down to the locale. And I'll start by asking Andy to share with us some of those water security policies and maybe consider how they've evolved over time and where we are today. Andy?
Thanks, Dave. Well, I would say that for many water utilities, the Clean Water Act is the starting place. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, the same year that the EPA was founded as well and created. And in my utility that I used to work in Camden County, New Jersey, the Camden County MU was created as a child of the Clean Water Act, created to bring Camden County into compliance with the new requirements of the Clean Water Act. Prior to that, the tributaries of the Delaware into Camden County were completely polluted with raw sewage, under-treated sewage going into the river. 40% of the main stream tributary of the Cooper River, which went into the Delaware, was 40% sewage. The bacterial rates were 10 times higher than what would cause a beach closing at the New Jersey shore. So, I mean, completely polluted in a dead stream. The wastewater treatment plant was also, not the main wastewater treatment plant for Camden was also, inadequately treating sewage into the Delaware. So the Clean Water Act required that all these treatment plants be upgraded, expanded, or eliminated. And so what we did in Camden was to eliminate 52 underperforming sewage treatment plants that were discharging into the tributaries of the Delaware and eliminate them entirely, and then upgrade and expand the treatment plant in Camden to significantly reduce the amount of pollution going into the Delaware. As a result, within 2 years, the bacteria levels in the tributaries dropped by 99% in just 2 years. That's how fast nature will come back if you let it up. And the water quality in our zone of the Delaware improved significantly, but all stemming from the passage of the Clean Water Act and then administration by EPA, the Delaware River Basin Commission, Steve Tambini's organization, and also EPA. So there's an example of a regulation that completely drove water quality improvements.
Gary, perhaps you want to jump in there, and I know American Rivers is instrumental in getting involved with Clean Water Act and policy. So you share some perspective there.
Sure. Well, just jumping on what Andy said, the Clean Water Act, we really see the Delaware River as a Clean Water Act success story, which is one of the reasons why we've listed it as this River of the Year. And those permits are really key to cleaning up the water security, and the investment that comes into supporting our our water treatment plants to get there. Just diving into a little bit more detail, for us in our urban areas, as those permits have come into effect and have improved industrial pollution, they've improved wastewater treatment. In the 90s, stormwater permits really came into effect. And this is one of the biggest challenges we face in urban areas today, is all that stormwater, those rainwater falling on our roads, on our roofs, collecting pollution as it goes into your storm drain and into our local streams and rivers. So these stormwater permits that were part of the Clean Water Act that were put into place in the 90s is another key component of that Clean Water Act success, and that it's really helping us achieve a more holistic approach to how we manage water in our urban areas and how we're addressing pollution. So for us, that's a key, another key element to that Clean Water Act success, and I think it'll be a key part of the future moving forward.
All right, how about Jeff? Maybe share through the lens of recreational access and security of those uses for our society.
Right. When if we're talking about policies for water security in the Upper Delaware River, I've been a fan of the Clean Water Act my whole life, my whole career. I've worked closely with it. When I arrived into the rural areas of the Upper Delaware River watershed, it was clear to me that the Clean Water Act does not play as relevant a role up here as a general matter, because we don't have the permitted discharges. It's more of a diffuse, non-point landscape up here. Doesn't mean the Clean Water Act doesn't play at all. It certainly does, and we don't have enough time to get into how. But as a general matter, when we work for water security, water supply, clean water, it has to be done through partnerships and voluntary approaches. So that's the general theme here. The two policies that come to mind for the Upper Delaware River, and I'm talking about in the western Catskills of the state of New York, the southern tier of the state of New York, northeast Pennsylvania, Delaware County, Sullivan County, New York. The two policies that come to mind in this context for me is again, I sometimes use the phrase up here, it's a tale of two watersheds, even though it's really just one watershed, the Delaware River watershed. It's in the very top is what's often referred to as the New York City watershed. And that is 50% of the water supply that that arrives in New York City every day comes from the Delaware system, right? And of course, that's an out of watershed diversion. New York City is obviously in the Hudson River watershed, and everything that goes along with that, and that's been going on for decades. The city has spent billions and billions of dollars to protect that watershed, and it comes with some controversy, but overall, it's recognized as one of the finest watershed protection programs really in the universe. And they do this to avoid federal requirements for filtration for their water supply. So that's a whole different landscape. We often use the term above the reservoirs, and those are the Cannonsville, Papacton, and Neversink reservoirs in the Catskills. And then below the reservoirs is a subject that's, I know, near and dear to Steve's heart too, and he'll, I'm sure, mention it, is the role of the 1954 Supreme Court decree parties. Those are the four border states, the governors and New York City, and a directive out of two decrees that essentially provides guidelines for provisions for how we manage those reservoirs and how much water is going which way, how much water is going to the city of New York underground through their system for water supply, and how much is being released to the Delaware River way up here where I sit today, which has a lot to do with the entire river, the condition of the entire river. And then finally, the plan that manages those reservoirs is called the Flexible Flow Management Program. That has a long history. Generally, it's been a good trajectory, and we're in a reasonably good place now with how that's administered. Always room for improvement. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a good segue to Steve, and I think Steve might share his screen and have some slides, but maybe you can walk through the history of water use in the Delaware and resulting policy, and share with us how did we get to where we are today.
Yeah, I will share slides in a second. I'll just say that I certainly agree with Andy and Gary about the Clean Water Act, and I'm going to touch on that in a bit. Certainly, Jeff hit the nail on the head in terms of the importance of the Supreme Court decree. I would be remiss if I didn't say that Delaware Basin Compact should be a policy that should be recognized as well, and I'll touch on that also. Dave, I also appreciate the question. I think the way you asked it about water security is really unique, because a lot of times we talk about water availability and water quality, but water security is really important, especially when you think about the Delaware Basin. Just picture a map of the United States for a second. And I think we've all seen this, the great rivers of the United States. You kind of almost have to squint to see the Delaware Basin. It's like 0.4% of the land mass of the United States, but it serves 4% of the population. So when you think about water security, think about all the needs that the basin has to deal with, including the 13 million people, 4% of the US population. That's pretty significant. Gary, I'm going to share my screen now. Is that okay? I'm sorry, Dave.
Yeah. Let me know if you have any challenges there.
Yeah, and likewise, let me know as well. So let me see if I can do this. So can everyone see that?
We're good.
I'm going to talk a little bit about evolution of major policies in the basin. First, starting with flow, and I think Jeff touched on where it all started. And typically water policy, when you think about, clean water and safe drinking water, a lot of times those are driven by national federal regulation, but there is no federal regulation concerning safe yield or drought management or flood management. We kind of deal with that either through planning, through conflict, or through collaboration. And it sort of started out in terms of conflict. And the states, Jeff touched on the story, effectively, we've got this relatively small basin, but New York City at some point was growing, and New York City said, I want more water. They needed more water, and they wanted to get high quality water. So they went to the Delaware Basin. And as you can imagine, they went to the headwaters, because that's where the good water was, and that's where they could derive it from. But as you can also imagine, in dealing with the water security issues, the down basin states said, whoa, we need that water as well. In fact, New Jersey wanted to export water out of the basin also. So both in 1931 and 1954, the states had conflicts. They took that conflict to the Supreme Court. And I'm going to touch on the 1954 decree, because that's kind of the foundational policy that's going on right now. And it set some very generally simple principles. One is that New York City could take water out of the basin, a significant amount of water out of the basin, up to 800 million gallons per day, if they built additional storage to do that. And that's similar to what happened in 1931. But in 1954, they wanted to build another reservoir, and they said, okay, you could take more water as long as, one, you build more storage, two, that you provide a steady amount of flow to a place where the three states meet in the upper basin. New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey meet at a place called Montague, New Jersey, and they set a flow target for that. They also said New Jersey and New York City could take water out of the basin. As I said, you needed to build some reservoirs to do that. And they had this principle that seems in concept fairly straightforward, but has some controversy over the years, and certainly not always easy to figure out. But they said, if the demands of New York City are less than the safe yield, some of that excess water could be released downstream. It also said that the Supreme Court, if somebody had continuing conflict, people had to go back to the Supreme Court, just like they did between 54 and 31. But in 1961, the four basin states and the federal government had tried over the years to manage this watershed on a piecemeal basis. And we all know, and I think they recognized back in 1961, that in order to manage the watershed, you should do it on a watershed scale basis. And they said, we're going to manage this watershed with a commission through a compact, through an agreement, through law, through the power of law, that said, okay, we recognize what happened with the 1954 Supreme Court decree. We're going to make sure that we manage the other water and have equitable apportionment of that water. There was a couple other drivers for the commission. One, there was severe flooding. Two, we touched on the Clean Water Act issues and the severe pollution that was occurring in the Delaware estuary. We'll touch on that in a second. But it also gave the water managers, the decree parties, the stakeholders a tool to deal with the rigidity of the Supreme Court decree. And it said, you can potentially change the Supreme Court decree with the unanimous consent of the parties to the Supreme Court decree. Now, the commission includes the 4 basin states and the federal government. It does not include New York City, but New York City is a decree party. So it began to provide a concept of adaptive management, a policy that things can change. Now, right after 1961, when the commission was formed, I put on here in red and in yellow all the drought emergencies and drought watches and drought warnings that have occurred over the years. But if you look at 1965 to 1967, right after 1961 was the drought of record for the Delaware Basin. There's also some indication that that's not the worst drought of record, but just what's on record. So what happened then? You've got a decree that's pretty solidified, but you've got the ability, and there's nothing in that decree about drought management, but you've got this compact that can allow adaptive management, that can allow those policies to change. So the decree parties in the commission got together in the late 60s, throughout the 70s, and finally came to a good faith agreement in 1983, which is a big policy change for the commission that was codified in DRBC water code, federal code, that said, we're going to add a drought management component to this. Not only are we going to set a flow objective in the upper basin, we're going to set a flow objective in the lower basin at Trenton to make sure that we manage salt water, because the Delaware River is unique in that there's no dams on the Delaware River. So you've got an estuary that begins at Trenton that goes from freshwater to brackish water to ocean water. And there's nothing that's stopping ocean water from coming up except fresh water going down. And in the 60s, there was an issue with salt water getting close to the city of Philadelphia intakes. So that policy provided the beginning of this adaptive management. As Jeff has touched on, we've also got something called the Flexible Flow Management Program, which also provides for things that are not necessarily covered by the water code or even the decree. They impact the decree and they impact the flows. So the decree parties are definitely involved with it. The commission's involved with it, but it looks at things like habitat preservation, cold water fisheries, flood mitigation. What I don't have on the screen here is between 2002 and 2007, you had severe floods in 04, 05, and 06. And people wanted to look at how flooding could be mitigated. So the Flexible Flow Management Program provided additional level of adaptive management. So if you have a takeaway from the screen, I think the one takeaway is we've got policies here that are foundational, policies that are, from a flow perspective, that are codified. We've got the commission that has the authority of law to make decisions and policy and create a comprehensive plan on a watershed basis. But we've also got tools to be able to deal with these things adaptively. If we have time, Dave, I just want to touch on the water quality part of this story as well. Is that okay?
Yeah, just maybe another minute.
Sure. I won't start from the beginning. I'll just say that we talked about the Clean Water Act in 1972, and the 101A goals of the Clean Water Act are clear. Fishable, swimmable waters throughout the country, setting up water quality standards to do that, making sure that, really important policy perspective, making sure that the federal government funded wastewater treatment that Andy so eloquently talked about, because that funding came. But in 1961, the DRBC was given the authority by federal law to control future pollution and abate existing pollution. And DRBC set the first interquality water quality standards in 1967 and set waste allocations in place, the precursor to TMDLs, that were used by the states and deferred to DRBC and are still to this day deferred to DRBC as water quality standards. So while the Clean Water Act is a success story throughout the country, we're not quite there yet to fully fishable, swimmable yet. This basin had the unique ability and still has the unique benefit of the River Basin Commission setting out a plan as to how to get that done before the Clean Water Act was even in place. Since that time, there's been DRBC policy to set special protection waters in place, which really benefited the headwaters of the basin, to make sure that we've looked at legacy pollutants like PCBs, which is really, from an equity standpoint, helped people who spend time recreating and fishing in the Delaware River estuary, and improved fish consumption advisories. And then really another really important water quality improvement came in 2016 with the Delaware Basin Conservation Act that created the Delaware River Basin Restoration Program. So I'll just end it there because that's probably enough to set the stage.
Yeah, that was excellent. Amazing that you covered that territory in a short period of time. I think what really is remarkable there is the complexity and the number of different stakeholders and different perspectives that have to come together to build this sustainable or achieve sustainable water management for so many different needs out there. We could clearly dive a lot deeper into what Steve just shared with us, but I think we'd like to share a couple other perspectives and directions here. I'll return to Jeff and just maybe get back to some of the recreational uses and from today and maybe looking forward. Maybe you can just share with our audience what those dominant recreational uses are and what you might see as some challenges present day and into the future for those stakeholders.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I mean the story of the Upper Delaware River and how we view it and how we use it and love it and enjoy it is really the primary story is about recreation. So it's a very rural section of the watershed, and as I mentioned before, it has this world-class wild trout fishery that attracts fly fishermen and anglers from all over the world during the recreational season, which is not that long because it's pretty cold up here. But that is, it's so important to this region. And we talk about it all the time. It is linked in, of course, with tourism and economy, right? So the way the economic landscape has shifted over the decades up here, the story of this area in the 1950s is very different than the story that we have now. And so we've increasingly become economically reliant on the Upper Delaware River. People who live here, work here, have businesses here. That is a trend that is growing in terms of the recreational attributes of the river. So we have to be very careful to protect that, preserve that, restore that. And it's interesting because we are located in, we're really in a crowded part of the United States when it comes down to it, right? Even though we are in a rural section of the watershed, we're still in the northeastern US, and we're a day's drive away from major urban centers. And so we every day we try to strike the balance between promoting the river, getting people to understand what a high quality resource it is, but we often say we love the river, but we don't want to love it to death. So you ask me, what's a future threat that we need to get our arms around? It's certainly that. How are we going to, into the future, how are we going to manage the use of the river for recreation, for its recreational attributes, and make sure that it's also protected and preserved? We also have a national park up here, right? We have the National Park Service and the Upper Delaware Council, and they're also working on a river management plan. That's an attractive tourism element here too. People want to come up and enjoy the Upper Delaware National Park unit. So I would say that the increasing pressure on the river as a result of its beauty and its attractiveness, we have to keep an eye on. Obviously, the impacts of climate change and flooding. This area is the wettest area in the state of New York. Every year we have, Steve mentioned 04, 05, 06. Those are the poster child stories of flooding up here, but we get lots of flooding. We get lots of water up here. In some ways we're fortunate with that, but that does impact our communities and our residents. And that trend seems to be going in a direction where we are going to have to put some more resources and thinking into how we address that. And then the flexible flow management program that Steve also mentioned, that's an ongoing discussion, always will be. How the reservoirs are managed, the consumptive use of water being diverted to the city of New York to the tune of roughly 550 million gallons per day, 50% of their water supply. That's water that's leaving the Delaware Basin and going to the city of New York. And then how much is being released, coming down the rivers. That's going to be an ongoing discussion and challenge, I think, forever, probably. But like I said earlier, I think the trajectory of that in terms of the resource, protecting the river, the resource, the fish, the economy is going in the right direction.
So let's bring in the lens of municipal water use, maybe the drinking supply lens. drinking water supply lens. Andy, and maybe you can share what you view are the challenges that municipal use or access has had in the past, what innovations are there. And I know too, you're tackling issues of water equity and balancing the sort of optimizing access as well as water quality for many, many stakeholders. I mean, you know, everybody in the discussion here is concerned about that, but perhaps you could share a few thoughts on those topics.
Thanks, Dave. Well, I would say that water equity is definitely a passion of mine, and I think there's really two sides to the coin. On the one hand, you know, I believe, and many people and everyone on this panel believes, that everyone deserves, you know, the right to have safe drinking water and clean waterways, no matter where they live, who they are, or what they look like. Unfortunately, though, you know, sometimes that does, where you live does make a difference, and what kind of community you live in does make a difference. I remember when I first started my career, our regional wastewater treatment plant was 100 yards away from a residential neighborhood. So there are many communities that have disproportionate impact. Here in the Delaware River, the 330-mile stretch of the Delaware, there's nearly all of it meets you know, the optimal performance level, the primary contact, except for a 27-mile stretch that ranges from Philadelphia to Chester, and that's, you know, largely due to combined sewer overflows from those, you know, three historic cities. You know, combined sewer systems are anachronistic sewer collection systems where the stormwater and the sewage are blended together. So, you know, Steve had referred to them, and so had Gary rather, with regard to the you know, the stormwater management regulations in the 90s. So combined sewers have to be managed. Older cities, you know, have them, not just Philadelphia, Camden, Chester, but Chicago, New York City, Boston. They were the state of the art at the time. But what happens when it rains, and it rains too much, and especially with climate change, you know, the storms are more, there's more severe storms and more of them. And so we're getting, you know, more of a burden on these combined sewer systems, so more overflows into the river. So one of the things that Delaware is going to have to, you know, deal with, as well as other, you know, CSO communities across the country, is how to deal with these combined sewer systems and minimize their overflow, minimize their adverse impact, so that people can have access to clean waterways and drinking water, but also do it in an equitable way so that low-income communities aren't overly burdened with, you know, gigantic rate increases as well. So it really is a balancing act. On the one hand, everyone deserves safe drinking water and clean waterways, and they need the infrastructure required to accomplish that. But we need to do it in an equitable way so that low-income households, who are the most vulnerable to rate increases to accomplish that, aren't unduly burdened, have their ships sunk, to pardon the pun. So that is the balancing act in the water sector. One of the things that we're really glad to see in the CARES Act at the end of this year was a low-income water assistance program for the first time. So for heating and electricity, there's LIHEAP, you know, for low-income households, and that water has never had that until for the first time, largely due to the COVID crisis, which has exacerbated the economic situation and the need for not having water shut off. But that's a good start. We're hoping it's a forerunner for a permanent low-income water assistance program across the country, because if low-income households are properly buffered and they're only paying what they can afford, and their income, their bills are a portion is paid to this program, then the utilities have more of an ability to deal with the other half of the infrastructure challenge and provide the infrastructure that's needed to create clean waterways and safe drinking water without having to worry about burdening low-income households beyond their ability to pay. So that a low-income water assistance program will really make a difference to help the utilities and regulators balance these two halves of the water equity coin and restore our rivers across the country.
That's great. Thanks, Andy. I see we're getting close to our quarter after time slot. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. We have a few that have come in, but I want to make sure, Gary, we return to Gary. And, you know, Gary, you can either share some thoughts that might be stewing after listening to your colleagues here. But I'm curious from your perspective, and maybe American Rivers, some of the policies or other tools that are currently at our disposal or maybe developing out there that can be most useful from your perspective in moving forward and how we manage our water resources.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of start that with just a brief little story. When I have some relatives that live in Philadelphia, so I remember driving up I-95 as a young boy and seeing the Delaware River as you come up past Wilmington and into the city, and just all the ships, and it just looked really big and industrial to me. So when I actually, as a young man in college, went and visited some friends in Trenton, and they said, "Oh, we're going to take the boat down to Penn's Landing," and then I got on, went to this marina, got on a boat, and we're floating down the Delaware to Philadelphia from Trenton, and this just kind of blew my mind as a young man. It's like I felt a little like George Washington, somehow crossing the Delaware, except it was the middle of summer and we had some drinks along the way. But one of the things that also hit me was to see some of those, some of the drainage pipes into the river as we floated down, and to see this combination of forested areas broken up by cities and urban areas. And as I learned more about the Delaware and just how, for such a small watershed comparatively, how densely populated it was from an urban perspective, but also how diverse it was in terms of its ecosystems and the quality of the river, it just kind of blew my mind, all the different ways that water intersected with the river, whether it was wastewater, whether it was stormwater, whether it was, fishing, so many different things on this small river. And so I think from American River's perspective, what's important to moving into the future around policy around the Delaware is the need to collaborate amongst all the different geographies and the different entities on that river. And I think that's what's led to its success. You have these policies like the Clean Water Act that are implemented because people care about the clean water. You have the sharing agreements around the Delaware Basin Commission because people are worried about the drinking water and what it means to collaborate up and down. You have the city of Philadelphia implementing some really cutting edge stormwater management around natural infrastructure because they want to build up this resource that is the city. And I could go on for hours about Andy's work in Camden and about the equity component about this. So there's so many different segments of our community, our cities that interact with the water that it's going to be really important that we take a one water approach. And what do I mean by one water? It's, the wastewater sector, stormwater municipalities, you've got the park sector, recreation. We all need to be collaborating around water and collaborating together about how we design our policies, design our cities, so that we're all thinking about water and how our different, we touch it in different ways, and we're working together to continue to improve it moving forward. So for us, that sort of collaboration and innovation that's happened in the Delaware to this date is what's led us to listening to the River of the Year. And I think that's when it's going to take us into the future, is this collaborative one water approach of how all of these different sectors are going to be working together, need to work together to continue to maintain that success and build on it into the future. So when I take my son up to visit our relatives up in Philadelphia, he won't be distracted by the shipyards or the pollution. He'll actually be amazed at what a clean river this is that's shared by many from the mouth near the Delaware Bay all the way up to the headwaters, where Jeff's going to take me fishing next year when we're out of COVID. So.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Gary. I'm seeing we have a little bit less than 5 minutes to address a couple of questions, and I would encourage our panelists to take a look at the QA, and perhaps you have some thoughts you can type in to get those answers. We'll also be capturing these and maybe providing some answers when we circulate the recording. But there's a lot of good questions here, and I just have to sort of pick one on the fly to start with. I think there's lots of challenges that you all have recognized, and I think climate and the future of our climate and water volume come to mind for me as I'm listening. There's one question in here about sort of the concern of flooding and managing flood, and you all have talked about stormwater runoff and water quality, water quantity issues. The question that specifically comes from Gene Smiling Coyote: how about down zoning to get vulnerable buildings and structures out of place which flood, and those sorts of strategies? Maybe somebody would like to take a stab at some of the challenges, not just fringing infrastructure and damages to those communities, but other future climate concerns that are out there. Anyone want to jump on that? Gary?
Well, I'm going to say, from a perspective of climate concerns, we're going to see larger and larger and more intense rain events moving forward. And so that's going to result in issues around flooding. And when we're talking about the increased urbanization, particularly on the East Coast and in this particular corridor, when you have these rain events hit those hard surfaces and it accumulates, you're going to see lots of flooding, particularly I think lower income communities are going to be impacted the most. And we're going to see a lot of increases in pollution as stuff that accumulates on these roads and driveways gets washed into the river, and that doesn't even include erosion and all sorts of other things. So I think that's probably one of the biggest, and particularly for low-level areas that are going to flood from the river itself as it raises. So that's, for me, that's the biggest climate impact, and I think that's going to be a combination of, like I said, why the One Water management is going to be so important, so that we're all collaborating moving forward. And I think stormwater and how we address that in our urban areas is going to be critical as well.
I totally agree.
Andy, and then Jeff, and why don't we end with Steve on that?
I totally agree with everything that Gary said. I think that I know there are those across the country that don't believe in climate change, and I'm not one. But when I think about people that may not necessarily believe, I don't think there's anyone on this call probably that doesn't believe. But those that don't, I look at it as climate history. You can see that whether you believe in climate change or not moving forward, you can see some storms like Hurricane Sandy in this region, or storms in Florida, Puerto Rico, Houston, et cetera, that the New Orleans, that the infrastructure as we have it now is not adequate for how the climate is right now. And so the infrastructure needs to be upgraded just to meet where the climate is now, even if it doesn't get worse, and it is likely to get worse. So there are three challenges that need to be met. As Gary said, more severe storms, so therefore, especially with combined sewer systems, they need to be either expanded, separated, and the wastewater treatment facilities expand to receive more flow because there'll be more flow, number one. Number two, we need to worry about wastewater treatment plants because of severe storms. There's a higher probability of power outages. And so think of a sewage treatment plant like the one I worked in Camden, up to 80 million gallons a day, goes out of service for a week due to a power outage. That's 500 million gallons of raw sewage going into the river, which would undo much of the work we've done for the previous year or so. So making sure that our treatment plants and pumping stations are resilient. The treatment plant in Camden is actually entirely off the grid. It runs on solar and biosolids. So therefore, if there's a power outage, the plant still runs. So making our treatment plants more resilient against power outages is the second thing. And then the third thing is we have to worry about river level rise. The EPA has calculated that the Delaware River is supposed to rise by 1.5 feet by 2050, which will significantly bring challenges of water coming in or stormwater going out.
Good points, Jeff.
Yeah, real quick, in the upper watershed, the rural sections, the question, the person who wrote the question used the term downzoning. Up here, regulatory approaches to these kinds of issues, there's less of an appetite, I'll put it that way, for regulatory approaches, and more of an appetite for volunteerism, collaboration, and alternative approaches to the issue of flooding. I would say that a great contribution that has been made is the program that Steve touched on, the Delaware River Basin Restoration Program, that has, in its 3 years of existence, it has now invested over $2 million between FUDR and our conservation partners in restoration projects. Think of them as green, I guess you could think of them as green infrastructure, or we do these projects in large part, we work with, for example, Trout Unlimited, so we're thinking about fish protection. But these stream repair projects have multiple benefits, and one of them is flood mitigation. So in the upper rural sections of the watershed, stream restoration is how we get at flooding more so than regulatory approaches.
Great. Steve, I know that the Commission is having lots of discussions in this vein. Maybe very briefly you can touch on.
Yeah, I'm just going to end where sort of we started, which was the question of water security. And when you look at the question of water security, certainly one of the big issues is, are our water resources, and specifically is the Delaware Basin, resilient to extremes? And with climate change, we know it's going to, it is, and it will impact the water cycle. It's going to impact potentially droughts. It's going to impact flows. Potentially is going to impact non-tidal flooding and tidal flooding. Sea level rise clearly is a challenge that we have to deal with. So there's no question that as we look at, and I think Gary's comments were spot on about the one water approach, but I think our continuing challenge for the future is going to be to deal with the prioritization of everything, all the complex issues that we have to deal with, and layer on top of that the lens of climate change and what that's going to mean to the hydrologic cycle, what that's going to mean to the management of water resources. We'll make those challenges and those priorities even tougher. So I think we do need a one water approach. I think we do need to look at everything through the lens of the future in terms of climate change. I also think we need to spend a lot of time thinking really hard about our priorities, because somebody talked about the Clean Water Act early and talked about how it funded the objectives of the Clean Water Act. Well, let's face it, in order to deal with some of the challenges we have to resource, fund, prioritize, and make sure that collaboratively we plan for the future with all that in mind.
That's wonderful. We're about 5 minutes over, but I'm seeing one more question that I think we should address, and that has to do with the equity lens issue and environmental justice. Just give each of us an opportunity to address the question. I mean, clearly we're a panel here of 5 white men talking about this issue and maybe representing our organizations. And we don't have diversity represented in our discussion today, but how do we address that issue, and what might your organizations be doing to ensure that there are equitable conversations and decisions being made out there? Andy, you raised your hand first.
Take a first shot at it. I think that every organization, no matter where they are, what they're doing, should be looking at two kinds of things, 2 categories. What they could do internally to promote diversity, equity, and equality within and inclusion within their own organization, but then also how are they going to move forward out and promote that outwardly in their work. So what they're doing internally to make sure their own organization is representative, diverse, inclusive, and equitable, but also that their work externally is doing that. So, for example, the Water Center at the University of Pennsylvania has adopted the University of Pennsylvania's diversity, equity, and inclusion policy to try to make sure that the Water Center is more diverse, but also that its work is moving forward. I also work with the U.S. Water Alliance, which is promoting a national water equity initiative, trying to ensure that wastewater utilities and drinking water utilities are environmental champions and anchor institutions in their communities, looking to try to deal with water equity issues like affordability, like low-income affordability, combined sewage flooding, lead in drinking water, et cetera, water workforce opportunities. So I think the goal is to achieve DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion within, and also promote it in your work without.
Excellent, Andy. Steve?
Yeah, there's no question that the management of the water resource of the basin benefits when we get input from all voices. And I'm not sure in the past we've done that. So, and it also benefits when we make sure that everyone benefits equally from the resources in the basin. And I'm not always sure we've done that. So this past year, for the reasons we all know, DRBC is undertaking a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice strategic planning effort to look at the issues that Andy talked about, both internally, what can we do better internally as an organization, and externally, how do we outreach? How do we make sure that we're getting those diverse perspectives? How do we make sure that our actions from a regulatory standpoint look at environmental justice issues? I will say that I do want to thank the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed. They've done some tremendous work in this area, and we've benefited from it, and we're continuing to learn from it. And we're learning from other sources as well, but I think they've been a leader in this area, and I certainly want to thank Sandra and her team for their leadership and certainly the help they've provided us.
Yeah, I'll just share quickly. They've produced some nice white papers, PDF online, that can help organizations organize around these issues internally. That's just one. There's a lot of tools out there. Jeff or Gary, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say for the upper watershed, again, We grapple with this issue all the time. Actually, it's a fairly homogeneous culture up here that makes it, in my mind, makes it more difficult for us to think about these issues. But I think the primary the primary issue up here under this topic would be economic justice up here. We have, this is in many places a very impoverished area, but now we're seeing how the river can play a role in economy and socially and culturally. And I think when we think about this issue, that's how we think about it. And yes, I'll echo Steve's comments. We are the state lead group for the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed up here in New York. And so we work closely with them. And I will say that they are really, I think, on the cutting edge of thinking about this issue and how we can tackle it as we work in our own conservation world. So thank you for sharing that document. I think they have a, by the way, I think they have a webinar next week, or maybe no, tomorrow, I think it is, where they're talking about this very issue as one of their priorities for 2021.
Gary?
And I'll just say for us, I think the big thing is you hear it said that you can't solve climate change without addressing racism. And I think the same can be said for our issues of water and water quality. We're not going to be able to fix these problems without acknowledging that a lot of the systems of the past have had negative consequential impacts on communities of color. And so we're not going to solve any problems unless we address those issues moving forward. And so one of the things American Rivers is trying to do, well, internally, we're taking a hard look at how do we diversify our organization? I mean, great point. I'm a white male of privilege sitting here talking to you, but how do we build in those communities that are impacted and making sure they have a seat at the table and have power to this? So we're trying to create programs to diversify our internal workforce. At the same time, we understand that as a national group, we can provide resources and bring our privilege to bear to support those communities and community-based organizations that are really on the ground trying to address some of these issues of equity. So to the extent that we can provide resources for activists to learn more about the water systems and water management so they can better engage and be more successful with their advocacy at their local community level, we're trying to we've developed programs to try and support that to the extent that we can. And we're also trying to, money is a big thing for these local groups. So trying to make sure that we share our contacts with foundations and funders so that these local groups that really have that local expertise can get funding themselves to be doing that work. So it's not about one group winning out on the other. It's how do we all work together? And we can't work together for the success if we're not supporting these local organizations that are working on these equity issues.
Those are great points you've all made. And I just share Stroud Water Research Center is, I don't need to add too much. Andy, you outlined it, critically looking internally and seeing how we can enhance our diversity, ensuring that our programs outward looking are inclusive, and seeing how our mission can make an impact on the environmental justice issues in general. More on that later. But I want to thank our panelists for staying a little long, for joining us in the first place and staying a little longer than we anticipated. I want to thank our participants or our attendees for joining today. And I will just share with you once again their names and contact details if you'd like to get in touch with anyone you've seen here, or you can find me on the Stroud Center website. Happy to have an email. I didn't include mine there. And just close in advertising for our fourth and final episode in this series celebrating the River of the Year designation on April 1st, Thursday, April 1st, where the webinar will focus on federal protections for the free-flowing Delaware River. That might give you a little bit of an answer to one of the questions about dams on the Delaware River, but I'm sure we'll be talking about dams on the Delaware River at that webinar. So thank you all once again. This concludes our webinar for today. Have a great rest of your week and be safe. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Thank you, everyone.